So good evening again, and welcome to the Cherokee Garden Library virtual talk, To Heal and to Harm, Medicine, Knowledge, and Power in the Atlantic Slave Trade with Dr. Carolyn Roberts. My name is Stacy Catron, and I'm the Cherokee Garden Library Director for the Atlanta History Center. I am so delighted you're here with us this evening. I do want to let you know before we start our program that we will be taking questions at the end of the talk. So please add your questions for Dr. Roberts in the Q&A box throughout our presentation as you have your thoughts. That way we can garner a rich group of questions for our distinguished speaker. And I'll come back with you at the end to moderate the Q&A. For those of you joining us for the first time, I wish to share a little background. The Cherokee Garden Library was established in Atlanta in 1975 and is named for the Cherokee rose, which is our state flower. The library is one of the special collection libraries of the Keenan Research Center here at the Atlanta History Center. The library collects and preserves rare books, contemporary books, periodicals, manuscript collections, and visual arts collections ranging in date from 1586 to the present. These collections tell the many stories of horticulture and botanical history in the southeastern United States and all the areas of influence throughout the world. The library is deeply connected to the History Center's Wpa Gardens, a remarkable 33-acre green space here on campus that contains 9 distinct ecologically beneficial and educational gardens. Before I introduce Dr. Roberts, I want to invite each and every one of you to visit these gems of the History Center, either via our website or in person when you are in Atlanta. This evening, it is indeed my very deep honor to introduce Dr. Carolyn Roberts, historian of medicine and science and an award-winning educator at Yale University with a joint appointment in the departments of history, history of science and medicine, and African American studies. Her research interests concern the relationship between race and medicine, which she explores by way of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, natural history and botany, and African-descended knowledge in the Atlantic world. Her current book project is called To Heal or to Harm, Medicine, Knowledge, and Power in the Atlantic Slave Trade. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for joining us this evening. It is such a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Stacy. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss with you some of my research concerning African and African-descended people and their contributions to medicine and science in the context of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. So I have been studying the history of medicine and science in the slave trade for nearly 15 years. And it is a history of unimaginable horror, but it's also a history of resilience and resistance. It tells the story of a people who knew how to heal, how to cure, and how to overcome. So as we get started, I want to begin by inviting us to remember a little bit about the history of the Atlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a watershed event in our collective human story. It began in 1441 with the Portuguese and ended in 1867. So it lasted for 426 years. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced oceanic migration in human history. Over 12 million enslaved children, women, and men were trafficked to the Americas. Most of Western Europe was involved, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Spain, and Portugal were all involved. So this was a global trade in human beings. And this global trade in human beings provided livelihoods for many. And just think about this. The slave trade not only helped the wealthy elite amass greater political and social capital that endures today, but it also provided sustenance to the working poor. We only need remember small town cod fishermen in Newfoundland, or poor weavers in Wales, or copper miners in present-day Slovakia. From Massachusetts to Brazil, from the Netherlands to Angola, from Gujarat in India to the small island of Utimu in the Maldives, this trade in African people swept up much of the world. Dr. James Houston was a medical doctor stationed in West Africa, and he was a proud participant in the slave trade. He wrote that the slave trade is the hinge on which all the trade of this globe moves on. Put a stop to the slave trade, and all the others cease, of course. There was a lot at stake in continuing this trade that has been called a trade in human flesh. And so millions of enslaved children, women, and men were kidnapped, separated from their homes, families, and kin. They were chained. Some of them were gagged so that their pleas and their cries for help would remain unheard. They were incarcerated in coastal dungeons on the West African coast, and then put on board slave ships, where they were tortured, beaten, raped, and medically abused. Many in the African diaspora have adopted a Kiswahili word, mafa, to describe this 400-year-long devastation. Mafa is the great disaster, the great suffering, the great catastrophe. This image of people of African descent dressed in white are standing on a beach at the waterside with candles in their hands to remember and honor this living history. You see, the ocean is a witness. The ocean is a crime scene, a graveyard, holding the remains of all those who were tossed overboard or those who leapt into the cold, rushing waters of the Atlantic Ocean to escape the living death sentence of human bondage. Yet these individuals were not merely victims. They arrived in the Americas with rich medical and scientific traditions that they brought with them from Africa. Healing traditions in sub-Saharan Africa have been developing for over 3,000 years and represent one of the most developed medical traditions in the world, along with India and China. Now, when I began conducting research on the slave trade, it quickly became clear to me how valuable and sought after African and African descended knowledge was at the time. I began finding writings like this, and this is a text written by a Dutchman named Willem Bossem. He was stationed on the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana, and he wrote this in 1705. The green herbs, the principal remedy in use amongst the Negroes, are of such wonderful efficacy that 'tis much to be deplored that no European physicians has yet applied himself to the discovery of their nature and virtue. For I don't only imagine, but firmly believe that they would prove more successful in the practice of physic, which is another word for medicine, than the European preparations. And evidence like this kept coming. This is a letter, for example, from the Royal African Company. It was written in 1720, and it reads, "We should be glad to have the assistance of an able gardener, one that is well acquainted with herbs, as we believe there may be many simples," which is another word for medicines, for plant medicines, found here, a very great benefit, being observed to be made use of by the natives in pharmacy as well as surgery, and who succeed in many good cures in both. Now, the big science of the 18th century was botany. And here we see a slave trader, William Smith, describing African people who lived in present-day Ghana as those most skillful botanists, the Negroes, who know well the use of every herb and plant, and always apply them with such success that the cures wrought by them seem, at some times, to be little less than miraculous. Even doctors who were stationed in West Africa to support the slave trade commented on West African medicine. This was written by Dr. Henry Meredith in 1812, and he writes, "The women in general perform the office of the surgeon, as well as of the physician. Their manual operations are confined to scarification and cupping, both of which they perform with much dexterity. Their manner of selecting different roots and herbs, and their choice of them, discover no mean knowledge in botany. There is scarcely a plant known to them without its particular virtue among them." And another slave trader commented on how British doctors stationed in West Africa relied on African medical practitioners to cure them and their companions. This particular slave trader wrote, "I have been accused of making use of Blacks in preference to whites. However, as I see the medical faculty itself giving in to my pleas, I begin to think I am right." And so what he's talking about here is that medical faculty, doctors, physicians that are stationed in West Africa are using Black medical practitioners rather than Europeans. Now, this was written by, this is a double slide. My apologies. We're going to move on. We've already dealt with Henry Meredith. And so I kept finding evidence like this. In addition, I also began to find evidence that the British in West Africa desired to benefit from West African medicine to such a degree that they enslaved people who could serve them as doctors and doctresses. So I came across this kind of evidence in the archives. This is a little bit difficult to see, but it's part of a list of enslaved people held by the British at Cape Coast Castle. And if you look at the first blue arrow, there's a name there, and it's a tomb. And he is listed as a doctor. And then underneath him in the next blue arrow is Jack, who is listed as a doctor's boy or a medical apprentice. Jack would later be sent to England as a young enslaved man to study and work as a doctor there. We also have information on enslaved women who served as enslaved doctors. And as you can see in this image, they are listed as doctresses. If you see the name Amano, where the underline is, you can see that it says doctress next to her name. And here you see another woman named Dee Dee, who was also a doctress. And in fact, women in the research that I've done seem to dominate the enslaved medical corps at places like Cape Coast Castle. So in my research, there was a great deal of evidence that African medicine was considered efficacious, that African people's plant knowledge was deep and rich, and that African people were often considered better medical practitioners than Europeans. But then I got to a more difficult question to answer. And that was, what remedies did they use? I wanted to figure out what specific plants were they using in their healing practice. So I had to keep searching for evidence. And I read texts that were written in 17th and 18th century English and French and Spanish and Dutch and Italian to pull together a repository of knowledge. And this is some of what I found. A Portuguese slave trader named Duarte Lopes noted the widespread use of tucula, or African coral wood, to cure fevers and headaches, and this was done to great effect. Now, the leaves of this plant are edible, and we know today that the leaves contain large amounts of vitamin C, and the leaves also have the ability to increase white and red blood cells, as well as hemoglobin. So today, its uses in West and Central Africa extend to treating chronic anemia, diabetes, hypertension, and renal infections. And the fresh leaf samples of the plant have been taken in Nigeria, and they were submitted to chemical investigations. And the plant is now considered a powerful anti-diabetic agent. Enslaved healers on the Windward Coast also used bark from the bongia tree to help ease difficult pregnancies. Today, it's used in several different African indigenous medical systems to treat worms and syphilis and to correct digestive disorders. Its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties have been confirmed through phytochemical screenings. We also have evidence of medicinal cordials being made with bark from the dewey tree, which was steeped in palm wine and then drunk. The dewey tree is one of the most widely used medicinal plants in Africa, and the bark and leaves exhibit powerful antibacterial and anti-inflammatory activity. Enslaved healers at Cape Coast Castle grew and utilized velvet tamarind to treat fevers. The inhabitants soaked the pulp of the fruit in water, and the resulting beverage was then drunk by fever patients with positive results. Researchers today have confirmed the analgesic, antimicrobial, antibacterial, and antimalarial qualities of velvet tamarind, which includes its ability to inhibit the growth of the Plasmodium falciparum parasite. That's the parasite which causes malaria. So it's an effective antimalarial. African basil was a fever remedy used by enslaved healers in West Africa as well. Africans boiled the leaves to create a decoction that was not only drunk, but was used in a steam bath 4 times a day. And in recent chemical screenings, we know that the essential oils in the leaves contain significant antimalarial properties. And researchers today also confirm that a steam bath is particularly effective for obtaining the antimalarial benefits. Camwood, or African sandalwood, was widely used to reduce fevers and to cure venereal disease. And slave traders observed Africans drying the leaves and the root bark in the sun. They powdered the dried matter and then mixed it with palm oil and applied it to the body. It was also consumed orally. Europeans noted that fevers were reduced and venereal disease symptoms lessened. Today, in chemical screenings, we know that the leaves and root bark contain antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and antioxidant properties. And in a 2015 journal article in the World Journal of Pharmaceutical Research, the authors write that African sandalwood could serve as a new antibiotic to replace strains that have become resistant. So enslaved people came to the Americas in the millions on ships of death. But for those who survived the brutal, violent passage, they kept hold of their medical knowledge. When we travel from the slave ship to slave plantations in the Americas, enslaved people developed their own medical systems. They blended medical knowledge from Africa with new resources in the Americas. The enslaved tried as much as possible to give medical care to one another and to avoid white doctors. African and African-descended people became known for their abilities to heal. Their knowledge of plant-based remedies was widely regarded throughout the Americas. So for example, some of our plant species are named after enslaved people. What you see here is Majo bitters, which is named after Majo, an enslaved healer in Jamaica. She used it to cure yaws and venereal disease. Also in Jamaica, an enslaved man named Kapkua conducted experiments with the use of hot springs to heal slaves, one who was lame from rheumatism and another who had no use of his arms and legs. So individuals like Kapkua and other African and African-descended people had their own experimental processes for testing their cures, and they delivered cures based on empirical evidence. Bitterroot, Quassia amara, is named after Kwasi, an enslaved man in Suriname, who effectively developed an effective fever remedy from the plant, as well as a stomach tonic and restorative. It became one of Suriname's major drug exports and was discovered by an enslaved man named Kwasi. And in the United States, this was true as well. So what you see before you was published in the Carolina Gazette in 1750, the Negro Caesar's cure for poison, and likewise his cure for the bite of a rattlesnake, for discovering of which the General Assembly have thought fit to purchase his freedom and grant him an allowance of 100 pounds per annum during life. We know that Caesar's cure was still being used and publicized in 1881. The writer proclaims that his father was an eyewitness to the efficacy of the remedy. So these are just a few examples of the evidence that exists confirming the important role played by African and African-descended people as medical practitioners, as botanists, as the knowers of plant medicine. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. And I want to focus on two events that speak directly to major historical events in colonial America that often exclude Black people, although African Americans were central to the story. And these two are the smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721 and the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in the new United States in the year 1793. So we are now in Boston, and the year is 1721. A smallpox outbreak swept the city of Boston, and people were terrified. They were fleeing for their lives, and they had good reason. Smallpox was one of the world's most feared diseases at the time. Smallpox is a highly lethal and highly contagious disease. In the early 18th century, 1 out of every 10 people who caught the disease died from it. So in Boston in 1721, the population was roughly 11,000 inhabitants. Over 6,000 cases of smallpox were reported. So it was a dire situation. And this is where the enslaved man named Onesimus enters the picture. So who was Onesimus? We don't have an image of him, but we do have an image of Cotton Mather, who was the owner of Onesimus. Onesimus was given as a gift to Cotton Mather from his church. And Onesimus told Cotton Mather about the common practice of smallpox inoculation in West Africa, where he was from. Cotton Mather got additional confirmation from other enslaved Africans living in Boston as well. Inoculation had been long practiced in Africa and in Asia, but it was unknown in Europe. And the knowledge that Onesimus and other Black Bostonians gave to Cotton Mather produced a racial backlash. The white population of Boston was highly skeptical. Places like Boston were already dehumanizing Black people and their medical knowledge, seeing them as ignorant, as savage, and as liars. They called inoculation a Negroish cure. They attacked the Black population, writing, "There is not a race of men on earth more false liars." Cotton Mather's home was even firebombed. A note was attached to the bomb which said, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, a pox to you." But Cotton Mather fought back on behalf of African medical knowledge. This is what he said. "It is a common practice and is attended with success. I have as full evidence of this as I have that there are lions in Africa. And I don't know why 'tis more unlawful to learn of Africans how to help against the poison of the smallpox than it is to learn of our Indians how to help against the poison of a rattlesnake." So in Boston, a doctor named Zabdiel Boylston took Cotton Mather's advice and began experimenting with inoculation. 98% of his patients survived. Between 1721 and 1796, smallpox inoculation became more common. And then in 1798, physician Edward Jenner in England developed the first vaccine for smallpox. So while the history books tell us about Zabdiel Boylston and Edward Jenner, Onesimus and other Black Bostonians are unrecognized contributors to the history of the eradication of smallpox, and they are also part of the broader history of vaccination in the United States. And now we turn to Philadelphia, where Black people helped save a city from its first major public health crisis in the new United States. In 1793, Philadelphia was the richest city in the United States. Although Philadelphia was over 90% white, it was also home to what was quickly becoming the largest and wealthiest free Black population in the Western world. But then yellow fever struck. The culprit was the Aedes aegypti mosquito. The disease is transmitted to humans by the bite of infected mosquitoes. So what is yellow fever? So yellow fever is categorized as a viral hemorrhagic fever, or VHF, and VHFs are categorized by fever and coagulation abnormalities. So this means that the body's blood clotting mechanism is disrupted. It's a severe multi-system syndrome, which means that multiple organ systems are affected. And it's highly infectious. It kills quickly, often within 7 to 10 days. So the symptoms of yellow fever, the patient presents fever with chills, fatigue, severe headache, malaise, dizziness, nausea, delirium, loss of appetite, vomit that was green, yellow, or black, muscle pain, bleeding from eyes, nose, mouth, anus, vagina. So this was a horrible and painful way to die. The disease was called by some black vomit because of how copious amounts of black mucus and dried blood were expelled. People would be screaming in pain, yelling out with delirium, often seeming to go mad. Individuals had to be restrained from jumping out of windows or committing self-harm. So the city was in a panic. Of the 55,000 residents in the city, 20,000 fled the city for safety. The bodies of the dead began piling up in homes and on streets. If people left their homes, they covered their mouths with vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs. They walked down the center of the busy streets to get away from the contagion that dwelled in houses. People of all ages also tried smoking tobacco, believing it could help prevent the illness. And things got violent and cruel on the streets of Philadelphia. There were reports of married couples abandoning one another upon the onset of symptoms, and parents abandoning their children. You could be ostracized and left out in fields to die alone with no aid and no assistance. No one wanted to be near you because they thought the disease spread from person to person. Eventually, 5,000 people would be dead. 1/10 of the city's population perished. Now, in the early stages of the crisis, a doctor named Benjamin Rush reached out to the African-American community. And Benjamin Rush is an important figure. Rush was a founding father. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a politician. He was a physician. He was a chemist, and he was an abolitionist. And Benjamin Rush believed strongly in the medical knowledge and ability of Black people. And Benjamin Rush was considered the most prominent doctor in the United States at this time. So for example, Benjamin Rush considered James Durham a colleague. James Durham was born into slavery in 1762 in Philadelphia and is the first recognized Black physician in the US. 2 of his enslavers in Philadelphia were doctors. In 1783, James Durham was sold to a doctor in New Orleans, and Durham ended up treating patients of all races. Eventually, Durham won his freedom and set up a private practice in New Orleans, and he became a specialist in throat medicine, particularly the disease diphtheria, which was a dangerous and often fatal disease that infected the nose and the throat. Benjamin Rush tells us the following about James Durham. I've conversed with him upon the most acute and epidemic diseases of the country where he lives, and was pleased to find him perfectly acquainted with the modern simple mode of practice in those diseases. I expected to have suggested some new medicines to him, but he suggested many more to me. He speaks French fluently and has some knowledge of the Spanish language. Benjamin Rush also gives us insight into the important work being performed by African Americans when he describes his Black physician assistant, Marcus. He writes, he can turn his two hands to 100 different things. He puts up powders, spreads blisters, and gives clysters, which are enemas, equal to any apothecary in town. With a little instruction, he would exceed many of our doctors in the treatment of the present fever. But Rush also believed something that was troubling. Rush believed that Black people had a special kind of immunity to yellow fever. But Black people do not have a natural immunity to yellow fever. This was just a mistaken belief at the time. For example, John Lining, a doctor from South Carolina, famously wrote in 1748, there is something very singular in the constitution of the Negroes, which renders them not liable to this fever, end quote. So for Rush, who believed that Black people were immune, he reached out to Philadelphia's Black population to get their medical assistance. He wanted them to provide medical care to the white population, believing that they couldn't be affected by the disease. The people Benjamin Rush reached out to were his longtime associates, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Both men were born into slavery, but were able to save enough money through their industry and entrepreneurship to purchase their freedom. And for those of you interested in religious history, you might be familiar with Richard Allen, who was the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. So Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were responsible for mobilizing the Black community to take on major public health interventions during the yellow fever epidemic. The two men strategized with the mayor of Philadelphia and with Benjamin Rush. The priority was to provide medical care to the sick. So Jones and Allen organized a corps of workers. They staffed the hospital with African-American nurses, and the nurses provided patient care and assisted doctors on their rounds. Nurses also made home visits to the sick, traveling on horseback, by carriage, or on foot. Black street cleaners kept streets free of dirt, human waste, and corpses. Black foot patrollers made sure streets were kept safe and tried to prevent violence, theft, and other crimes from occurring. Black home inspectors checked homes to identify where the sick and dead were located. Black carters removed the dead bodies. Black grave diggers helped prepare the dead for burial and interred their bodies. So this was a massive public health mobilization effort that Black Philadelphians carried out during this public health crisis. Black people risked their lives and even got sick from the disease themselves, including Richard Allen. Some African Americans died while performing this medical labor. But what was the response to their labor? To the fact that they risked their lives to rescue the city from disease and to help the white population. Black people were not met with celebration and thanks. Instead, they were met with rampant hostility. Many white Philadelphians did not respond well because of racism. People who would never dream of having a Black person enter their front door, let alone their bedroom, were now dependent on a Black person who was wielding a knife and who entered the bedroom and opened a vein. So racial bias meant that many white people believed their lives depended upon the exertions and attentions of these despised people. They were left to the care, some people said, of merciless and perhaps drunken Black people. Matthew Carey led an attack against the Black population. And he distributed this pamphlet and made sure it was read widely. Although he wasn't even in the city during the disease, he leveled accusations against the Black healthcare workers. Carey accused the Black nurses who worked during the epidemic as some of the vilest of the Blacks. They extorted $2, $3, $4, and even $5 a night for attendance, which would have been well paid by a single dollar. Some of them were even detected in plundering the houses of the sick. So Carey was determined to discredit them, although they had helped save the city during its worst health crisis. He vilified them. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen fought back. The two men published a pamphlet, which was the first federally copyrighted essay by African-American writers in the United States. And we can think of this important publication as being part of a long, robust history of African-Americans using the printed word to fight against racism. In the text, Jones and Allen contest the myth that Black people were immune to yellow fever, writing, "When the people of color had the sickness and died, we were imposed upon and told it was not with the prevailing sickness until it became too notorious to be denied. Then we were told some few died, but not many. Thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives, yet you accuse us of extorting a little money from you." So what he's saying here, what the authors are saying here is that when Black people began to get sick from the disease, people were telling them that it wasn't actually the disease. And then when it became very clear that they were dying from yellow fever, people said, only a few of you are dying, not that many. And this is an important point that they're trying to make. Another important point they're trying to make is that the attacks made against Black nurses were egregious. They write, quote, "The case of the nurses in many instances were deserving commiseration, the patient raging and frightful to behold. It was frequently required 2 persons to hold them from running away. Others have made attempts to jump out of a window. In many chambers, they were nailed down and the door was kept locked to prevent them from running away or breaking their necks. Others lay vomiting blood and screaming enough to chill them with horror." So if you remember, delirium and madness are among the symptoms of yellow fever. And so what Jones and Allen are describing here are the patients that these Black nurses are trying to deal with. Thus were many nurses circumstanced alone until the patient died and then called away to another scene of distress, and thus have been for a week or 10 days left to do the best they could without any sufficient rest, many of them having some of their dearest connections sick at the time and suffering for want, while their husband, wife, father, mother, etc., have been engaged in the service of the white people. So African Americans in Philadelphia risked their lives. They wanted to use their medical and public health knowledge and skill to prove their humanity and equality with white people. Yet they were rejected. The US was a new nation, and Black Philadelphians were at the center of the new nation's first major public health crisis. Yet in public health classes and in the histories, you will not hear very much about them. And you will not hear very much about the Black nurses. So even today, Black nurses continue to fight for dignity and respect. So if we think about this history from the time of slavery and begin to flash forward into our present, we are faced with 2 different kinds of legacies. The importance of Black people in medicine and science took 2 different directions. One of medical exploitation and one of resistance and Black health activism. We've been looking now at the 17th and 18th centuries and about all of the health knowledge that Black people possessed. But medical exploitation was soon to come. Black people in the 19th century and 20th century would become the fodder for painful medical experiments, such as in obstetrics and gynecology. J. Marion Sims, who is considered the father of gynecology, experimented on enslaved women to develop an important surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistula. And as one British surgeon noted at the time, you could cut into the bodies of negresses like you did rabbits or dogs. And J. Marion Sims did just that. This is an image from a medical school in the 19th century, where they're dissecting a Black woman's body to advance medical and anatomical knowledge. And they wrote in chalk on the bench there, "Her loss is our gain." Black people's cadavers were part of an illegal cadaver trade that shuttled their dead bodies to medical schools all over the country, from Massachusetts to places like Harvard to schools in Texas. So after slavery, and in the midst of virulent racism, lynching, and segregation, Black people knew that they could only rely on each other. And so groups of Black women mobilized public health campaigns in Black communities across the country. Groups like the National Association of Colored Women, which was the first national Black organization in the United States, had a Department of Health and Hygiene. Their local chapters, such as this one from Newport, Rhode Island, integrated health education and healthcare into their activities. Negro Health Week was also instituted and lasted from 1915 to 1951. The first half of the 20th century also brought us an increasing number of Black healthcare professionals. And like my husband's father and grandfather, they studied at Black medical schools. They also practiced in a segregated profession. They were barred from the American Medical Association, and so they founded organizations like the National Medical Association, which is still thriving today. Black hospitals were also founded, such as Mercy Hospital in Philadelphia. So we still have a long way to go. There is still a great deal of racism in medicine. Racism in nursing, as you see here, it's being written about and described as an open secret. I don't want any colored nurses in my room. For some working in the medical industry, these are words they hear frequently. This was a set of tweets that went out around the same time. To be forced to watch a child die that you know you could have saved is soul crushing. The baby died because his parents refused to allow a Black nurse to save his life. And this isn't the first time I've seen this happen. Sick. We still have a far way to go. The Black medical school and nursing students who I work with at Yale and elsewhere face an uphill battle, but they are desperately needed. The problem is that they face resistance on multiple fronts, from their professors, administrators, and even the patients they are sacrificing themselves to serve. I hope that this history of African and African descended medical and scientific knowledge will help us remember that Black people have been involved in the work of healing and curing broken bodies in a broken world for centuries upon centuries. The struggle continues, but I hope and I believe that improvements and change will come. After all, this is a hashtag that I love. Hashtag what a doctor looks like. We are beginning to see more and more positive representations of our healthcare workers, and that is a beautiful thing. Thank you all so very much. Oh, Stacy, I think that you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible educational journey tonight. My mind can't even absorb it all. I was quickly taking notes through your whole talk and have so much reading and studying to do. I see we're getting a lot of questions, so I'm putting my own aside and not being selfish. And we'll share some of these meaningful questions with you now. Do you need a little break, some water or anything before we dive in?
I will take a sip of water.
Yeah, I know that was just a wonderful talk and a lot of energy. So one of our first questions, I'm particularly interested in the wide variety of sources you've found on this topic over your many years of research and in different languages and settings. What are some of the challenges of digging out these stories and evidence in your work?
It's such a great question. It is, it's interesting. In some ways, it's like being a detective, and you're searching for whatever clues you can find. But we're looking at fragments. And so part of the difficulty is getting enough fragments so that the picture begins to come into view, and then doing the very difficult interpretive work with all of those fragments. And so, for example, Henry Meredith, who was one of the doctors who commented, he writes a lot about African women's medical practice, but he also speaks against the kind of spiritual practices that these same African people are doing, also within a medical context. And so the doctors themselves are making a distinction between what they believe is kind of proper, acceptable, standard medical care and things like divination or the use of amulets and other practices like that. And so there's a real challenge to figure out what is the broader context of all of this. And in terms of all the different languages and sources, in some ways, reading these languages that are from the 17th and 18th century, so 17th and 18th century Italian or Dutch or German, it's sort of like being a code breaker. You learn the format of the language, the style, the syntax, and the vocabulary. And then it's a matter of just trying to comb through as much as you can. But again, different people are having different experiences in West Africa. And that also sort of colors their experience. And so Duarte Lopez is in the Congo region in West Central Africa, whereas other people that I'm studying are in Sierra Leone, or they're in what would be present day Ghana. And so there's a lot of work to figure out what those differences are in order to make sense of what I'm reading. You can't really just take it at face value.
Well, before I go into another question, one of my questions dovetails into that. Have you been able to go to West Africa to do your field work, or did COVID sort of put that on hold? I was wondering about that yesterday when I was thinking about your talk.
Yes, I was meant to go when COVID hit. And I'm still sort of struggling to figure out what to do, because now I have deadlines to my editor for the book. And so what might happen, because I honestly feel that the kind of work that I do on West African medicine in the book, which is really it's about 2 chapters out of the 7 in the book. I believe it's really sort of scratching the surface in a way. I'm sort of seeing it in some ways as a kind of first pass to this literature, and would love to go back and do oral histories and meet with scientific researchers who work on Indigenous medicine, and also to speak to Indigenous healers about some of the conditions that enslaved Africans were going through and how they might deal with things like serial dislocation and trauma and violence, and to really fill in all the pieces. So it may have to wait for the next, for my next book project, but I'm not entirely sure. It's still an open question for me.
Well, we will read all the books you write, so no concern there. Another question, did the enslaved Africans bring the plants with them on their journey, forced journey? Also, how difficult was it for them to find the healing plants they were used to once they arrived to the Americas?
Very good question. So there are ethnobotanists who study sort of plant migration and the movement of plants. And they have done research and shown that African people would often bring seeds with them. They would hide them on their bodies. They put seeds in their hair. The women would put seeds in their hair. They would even put things like rice in their hair. Judith Carney, who is a cultural geographer, writes about this in some really interesting ways. So we know that there are some plant species that were in, especially the Caribbean, that would have been familiar to the enslaved, and some of them would have been propagated by enslaved people. But there's also this process of migrant ethnobotany, which is, identifying substitution plants for things that you're just not finding and doing that kind of experimentation. And so when you think about being in a new landscape, in a new place with some plants that are familiar, some plants that aren't familiar, and trying to understand their uses and their potential for healing. I mean, it's a really intricate process that involves a great deal of experimentation and careful observation. And so, I mean, they were really doing a lot of scientific work to figure these things out.
Thank you. That was such a thoughtful response. Here's another very straightforward question from an attendee. Can you make available your list of references? I think many of us would love to follow up by reading these materials firsthand.
Yes, I don't know if, Stacy, if I can send you a bibliography that could live somewhere.
Absolutely, and we can send it out via email to everyone who attends.
Yeah, let's do that. So I'll put that together, because it is some of the texts are available, like the printed documents that I showed. A lot of those are available. For those who aren't associated with the university, they are available through Google Books. There's some sources that are, more difficult to access, but I will also just provide a list of materials, because there's a lot to read and digest there.
Well, thank you for sharing that knowledge. And to everyone listening, I promise you will get it on email. So another question, was there much interaction or intermingling of Indigenous communities and their medical knowledge with those of the enslaved communities and their knowledge? If so, how did these interactions, exchanges occur? And if not, why do you believe they did?
Great question. Yes, there was integration between these communities and the sharing of medical knowledge. Now, in the Caribbean, in the 17th and 18th century Caribbean, the Indigenous population there is decimated. There are so few left by the time we get to some of these sources in their writing. So we don't get very much in terms of like the British Caribbean. But one place where we see very interesting medical interactions and the sharing of medical knowledge is in the Spanish Caribbean. And there's a book by a wonderful scholar named Pablo Gomez, and it's called The Experiential Caribbean. And in that book, he describes how Indigenous and enslaved Africans are really part of a shared medical universe. And there's, because it's the Spanish Caribbean and there's the Inquisition, the benefit that we have now as historians to the fact that the Inquisition was doing what it did is that we have all these records. And the Inquisition, when they were bringing people up on charges, were writing very detailed accounts of the actual medical practices. And so what you see is in different parts of the Americas, depending on the colonizing nation, you have the availability of different kinds of records. The British really weren't writing down very much at all in terms of indigenous healing, whereas in the Spanish Caribbean they are. So it sort of depends on where you are. In the United States, there is some wonderful information about specific medical plants like Virginia snakeroot, which people were learning about from indigenous people, and other kinds of cures. And that kind of literature you can see beginning from the 17th century. And there's a little bit written about it. It's the literature is growing, but the sources are really difficult to use, to find, those fragments, those precious fragments just aren't plentiful. And so there are a lot of silences in the archive that we as historians have to fill as best we can through the contextual and interpretive labor that we do.
So let's see, another question, moving into the 20th century. Can you provide information regarding the Black nurses who worked with TB patients?
It's a history I only lightly touch on in my teaching because I focus on, in my research, I focus on the early modern period. But the work that I've done in looking at the Black club women and the nursing people that were attached to some of these hospitals, they were at the forefront of another major public health crisis. And the struggle for the Black nurses is that the TB is a disease of poverty. And so it was almost impossible to solve some of those problems until there was more public health infrastructure implemented. So in places like Atlanta, in the very early years of the 20th century, when you read about the segregation of the African-American community and the rise of TB, you see that Black people have almost no city services and that they're living by open sewers. And there's very little access to clean water, and some of the water is contaminated. And so it really required sort of public health infrastructure to be built to try to solve some of those things. And so once those things started happening, it became more possible for people to solve a disease like TB. And there were major sort of interventions made because white people were depending on Black people to clean their homes and care for their children. And there's a wonderful author, Tara Hunter, and she has a book called To Joy My Freedom. And the last chapter of that book, I think it's the very last chapter, is called TB, the Negro Servant's Disease. It was a disease that ended up being racialized. And so it was considered, Black people were more susceptible to it because their brains were smaller. So this is the beginning of scientific racism and all of these other ideas that are getting thrown into the mix in terms of Black inferiority. And so that's sort of the landscape, I guess, of around your question.
So another question, could you talk about how the herbs and other plants have worked their way into the pharmaceutical world? And do you see a through line from the slave period to the testing that the pharmaceutical industry does now in Africa?
Yeah.
Really good question.
It's a very good question. So one of the chapters in my book looks at the relationship between the rise of global pharmaceuticals and the slave trade. And, in that particular writing, it's happening, the influences are happening from two directions. So one is all of the different drugs that are being sourced from around the globe that are being used on slave ships and put into enslaved people's bodies. And so you have companies like GlaxoSmithKline traces its origins to a pharmacy in 18th century Britain called Ploughcourt Pharmacy, and it's on their website. It's part of their history. But Ploughcourt Pharmacy made all of its money by supplying drugs to the plantations and also supplying drugs to some of the slave trade pharmaceutical providers that I study. So you have one sort of like angle of the pharmaceuticals going in that direction. And the other angle is what you're specifically asking about, which has to do with the role of African medicine being put into sort of like the pharmaceutical, the pharmaceutical industry's sort of mandate of drugs. And in the period I study, there is less of that occurring because the British are not successful in the parts of West Africa where they're not successful in gathering enough of these drugs and medicine in order to make them lucrative for commercial sort of exploitation. But what happens by the time you get into the 19th century, when the pharmaceutical industries are involved in the colonial project in places like Africa, you see that beginning to happen. And now today, people talk about biopiracy and the fact that indigenous healers are being asked to identify plants. A lot of the plants are in the rainforest are asked to identify the plants, and they're asked to give a sense of how they're used by African people. And so they're serving as sources, really important sources of medical knowledge. There is a wonderful book by the last name of the author is Osare, and the book is called Bitter Roots. And it's about pharmaceuticals in Africa, focused on a few different plants. And this is a 19th and 20th century kind of story, and really looks at how sort of the fight over the property in these plants and the role of the pharmaceutical industry in really taking a lot of advantage of knowledge in other places and capitalizing on it.
So I have another question, and you can let her know the year it's coming out. She asked, did the professor publish this information? But I believe you have a forthcoming book. So
yes, I do. I have a forthcoming book, which should be out in we're in September 20. It should be out in the spring of 2023. So by the time it's between what they call between covers, like able to be held in your hand. So I'm finishing up the writing now, and then it goes through peer review, and then they make it pretty and all of that. So it's still a little ways off, but it's coming.
Well, I hope when it's released, you will come in person. You'll be able to come in person and do a big book talk here. Yeah. We'd be honored. Another question, a wow and a thank you so much from an attendee. Have you found that the trend of more enslaved women doctors, healers, continued to the area now known as the United States? Our doctresses that you were talking about in the records.
Yeah, it really was the domain of women. And it's so interesting, isn't it, that, I mean, we had, you saw Majo, bitters, and enslaved women, but Kwasi and Caesar are men. And they're given sort of like the imprimatur of like, this is real, valuable medicine. But in reality, it's the people like Lula Wilson, who I showed an image of. These women were midwives and healers, and they were doing the majority of that kind of daily care. Plantation owners actually relied on them to do a lot of this care. It was cheaper for them. They didn't have to pay them. And doctors would be brought in only if there was, something that was pretty dire. And so one interesting source that a lot of scholars use for looking at that in the United States are the WPA narratives. So the Works Progress Administration, they conducted interviews of formerly enslaved people in the 1930s. And there are thousands of pages of these interviews that are available online through the Library of Congress. And there are also some audio, so you can listen to some of these people as well. But online, if you look at the WPA narratives and you sort of search for medicine and healing, some scholars have identified where to look specifically for all the information about these enslaved women healers, and using peach tree leaves to cure stomach aches, and all of these wonderful kinds of things, and the reflections of enslaved people on the women who were doctoring them and caring for them and making them feel whole.
So I have many more questions, so we may have to stop here in a minute, but I will keep going. Another thank you and an excellent presentation from another attendee. She says, I'm an African-American woman currently working at the federal level on numerous public health issues, including COVID. Interested in lessons learned from the Philly outbreak, what resources do you recommend for me?
Yeah, one of my favorite books that discusses this is a book called Medicalizing Blackness by Rana Hogarth. Now, Rana Hogarth is a really interesting author. She's a historian. She works on 18th and 19th centuries, but she's also trained in public health. And one of the things that I really like about this book is that in the introduction or prologue section and towards the end as well, she talks about the ideas that really still are very pervasive that come from that period of time. The idea of Black people being immune to diseases is something that still is, an idea that circulates. But more importantly, that's important, but if we look sort of above that, what is the container for all of this? It's what is the role of race in terms of how we understand medicine and public health? How is race being used? Is race being used as a biological marker, which actually is impossible for it to, race does not figure as a biological marker. The categories that we have don't break down in any meaningful way biologically. And so one of the things that she does is she really uses this idea of race. It's why the book is called Medicalizing Race, the kind of long-standing impulse that we have in this country and in other places to use race as a kind of shorthand for talking about all different kinds of conditions, rather than thinking about what we would consider, as I'm sure the questioner knows, the social determinants of health. Why aren't we thinking about the sewers and the environmental toxins and the fact that, all these Black people may be exhibiting certain characteristics in terms of disease because they are living in similar conditions, not because their skin is Black or their hair is curly, and that those phenotypical markers have sort of biological meaning in someone's body in a way that contributes to disease. So this is an ongoing fight, and medical schools are taking a lot of action in terms of rethinking all of this. But it's a tough thing. But I think the public health aspect of Hogarth's work, especially by way of yellow fever, is a really good place to start. A lot of people talk about Black immunity to disease in different ways, but I really haven't, outside of Hogarth and her writing, I haven't really found very satisfactory writing about the public sort of the public health dimension of the yellow fever epidemic. And in fact, I mean, when I was putting together this material for a class that I teach, I mean, in some ways, I am sort of framing it in this particular way because it is a public health crisis. It was a new nation. This is all public health work. And this was mobilized in this, you know, extraordinary way. And so there are some primary sources that might be useful to look at as well about the yellow fever epidemic more broadly. Benjamin Rush has written about, has a book that might be useful for also thinking that through.
So more questions. Has there been any research into COVID treatments or cures from Indigenous Americans or African descended people?
You know, I have heard in passing some things, but the climate that we're living in right now is not conducive to thinking through those things right now. So I have read about studies, but they're not really being taken very seriously. And maybe once we have moved to a different place in terms of the pandemic, and you know, maybe people will be willing to think about this and talk about it and explore it, because there's, I think
back to I think it was the second slide in your presentation. We're talking about traditions that date back, medical knowledge that dates back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And then not to acknowledge that now seems absurd, truly. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you just think of it in that term. Mm-hmm. Another really good question. What impact do you think the exploitation of Black people in medical history research has influenced their apprehension of medical care, particularly vaccinations, in the present day?
Yeah, it's a question that I've spoken a great deal about in various talks and different forums. You know, I am a historian who speaks to the present in lots of different ways in terms of legacies. And so, you know, I do hold history in a very, you know, special place because I think through the past as, you know, part of my job. But one of the things that I am a little bit cautious about is this, yes, and is sort of how I would answer this question. Yes, the knowledge of the grave robbing and the medical experimentation that is so, by the time you get to Tuskegee, I mean, it's already been going on for, you know, 100 years. So we're talking about a very long, old history. And these are very real stories. And, you know, as a culture, the way that we understand the nature of time is really problematic because we want to imagine that if something happened, you know, 300 years ago, it's somehow less significant than something that happened, you know, yesterday or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But that's not the way that the mind and history and memory work. So yes, these things are important. They're part of people's sort of like innate kind of sort of like long developed distrust. And that distrust is very real and does come out of history. But Black people are living in the present. They're not living in the past. And the reason why I feel like it's so important to talk about what's going on in the present is because I think that it helps us get more closely at what some of these issues are. We know that when Black people are going into the consulting room and in going into hospitals and into clinics. We know that they're not listened to. We know that they're treated differently. We have now studies that go all the way back to 2002, one big national study called Unequal Treatment. We know that Black people and other minorities get poorer and often wrong treatment options from providers. There's an enormous amount of evidence and research on this that I show in different, when I do presentations of that kind. And these are sort of multivariate studies, meaning that they'll look at data where they can control for everything except for race. So they'll control for medical condition and socioeconomic status and all of those other things. So they can really drill down what is going on. Well, Black people are undertreated for pain when they go into the hospital versus other populations. We know that that's true even of children. We know that Black maternal mortality is a problem because Black women's pain is not listened to. We know from our medical school students who I work with and adore, we know that they're told in medical school that, you know, if a Black or Latinx woman comes in and says their pain is at a 10, that they should bump it down to a 6 or a 7. We know that this is going on. And so the level of distrust that people have about the medicine, about the healthcare system is very much a product of that, of something that they've lived through and know in their bones and has been confirmed and validated now through so many studies. And it's something of great concern for medical practitioners and healthcare providers who I speak with about, you know, the idea that Black people feel less physical pain than white people, which is, you know, part of the under treatment of pain for Black people. We know that medical school students actually think this, and because there was a study done in 2017 about this. So there are enormous problems related to race, bias, and medical care. And so I would say, yes, history has an important role to play, but when you walk in and have, you know, you walk into the hospital and you need help and, you know, you're treated in particular ways that go towards confirming all of these things that are part of that history. It's a real problem. It's a real problem.
So we have a few more questions, but we're at 8:25. So I just want to see if you feel up to hanging on for a few more questions. I know it's been a long day.
Sure, I'll do, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. First, a comment and then a question from an attendee. Your book, next publication, is worthy of all the awards. Thank you for fearlessly diving into these archives to tell these complex and important stories. Can you name the specific repositories and sources that were used to document enslaved people being used for medical practices and schools?
Oh, and for in the United States.
Yes.
We're talking about, yes.
I think he's referring to the United States.
Yes. So there's a wonderful book by Dinah Rainey-Berry called The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. And this book came out in 2017, and she is an economic historian who, I mean, it's an amazing book, but she was the one who discovered this illegal cadaver trade. And she found evidence in medical school archives, letters that were going back and forth between doctors at different medical institutions. And so the 19th century has a lot of information about that. The Medical College of Georgia, there's a lot that's been written about that, and there's material in their archives, including information about enslaved people who worked as janitors and were also grave robbers as part of their enslavement. This was part of what they had to do. And so that's been written about in some really wonderful ways. there is a book of photographs, archival photographs by John Warner on dissections. And so the medical school photograph that I showed is from that particular volume by John Warner. And there's a lot of material in newspapers. Charleston Mercury is like a treasure trove of material for we want, and they have advertisements for enslaved people's bodies, asking slave owners to give enslaved people to particular doctors to be cured if they seem incurable. And there's another one from Charleston Mercury that talks about that it's sort of an advertisement for a school saying that we have all of the Black bodies that we could ever want to practice on. And so that's part of how medical schools are advertising themselves, because it's illegal. It's illegal to do. It's illegal to be doing these dissections. But as Harriet Martineau wrote she wrote that in 1838, she was in Baltimore, and she was a British sociologist, and she wrote about the fact that the colored people can't refuse. Their bodies are the ones that are used exclusively for medical experimentation because the white people won't have it and the colored people can't refuse. And so there's lots of the sort of 19th century anatomy has definitely been written about in some very interesting ways. So other texts, there's a book by Michael Sapol about anatomy in 19th century US. But yeah, so there's definitely a lot of material that scholars are using. But the medical schools themselves are really important repositories for digging this material out.
So our next question goes in a completely different direction. An attendee asked, do you connect with the Chelsea Physics Garden in London for any of your research and information?
I haven't, and it was purely a matter of time because I spent, it's terrible. I spent 2 years in the UK doing archival research and went sort of so many different places and ran out of time before I could sort of do anything at the Chelsea Garden. It would have been, I did research at the Society of Apothecaries. So I spent time at Apothecaries Hall, and that was wonderful and really important because the pharmaceuticals that I study and the pharmaceutical providers were all members of the Society of Apothecaries, particularly during the first half of the 18th century. Even some of their most prominent individuals were supplying drugs to slave traders. And so combing through all of that material and just the project in general took so much time. I ended up not having time to go and do something, that would have been more enjoyable.
So another question, this attendee asked, besides immunizations, what African medicines and treatments have made their way into modern medicine? Ooh, that's a big question. We're a whole nother talk.
That is a big question. In the period that I specialize in the early modern period, there isn't a lot other than sort of these things that are being mentioned, the sort of the plant-based medicines that I mentioned. Things would, in terms of more recent times, in terms of colonial period, then, things like, if you Google cassava and vitamin C, like you can take vitamin C tablets that are made from cassava, because cassava was used during the slave trade as a kind of anti-scorbutic, so as a cure against scurvy, and scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. So that, there are things like that. But at what, you would need to study like every single drug and try to figure out its biography, which would be a really interesting project. But, at what point, the slave traders that I look at that are talking about how useful, cassava is for scurvy, how did it become the pill? How did it become, marketed into a pill? At what point in its sort of biography as medicinal? It's those kinds of questions, and that kind of searching, I think, would be a really, really interesting project to do, because there's so many of the, plant-based medicines dominate all of the medicines that we ingest. They are plant derivatives in various ways, so many of them. And a lot of these derivatives are coming from the rainforest. The rainforest, especially in places like West Africa and West Central Africa, is one of the world's largest repositories for medical substances. And so yeah, there would be a lot to pick through, I think, with that.
So I have a few more. Let's see if we can at least make it through one or two more. I know it's getting a bit late. Dr. Roberts, what inspired you to pursue this research? And thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. Another attendant, right?
You're welcome. I first came across the diagnosis of melancholia on slave ships by doctors. Mm. And that was the hook for me, because I wanted to know, why are they diagnosing their cargo with melancholia? Who are these doctors, and what are they doing, and what do they think they're doing? And I knew that there was a story about medicine and healthcare that needed to be unpacked. And very little has been written about the medical world of the slave trade. And one of the ways that I write about it is that the slave trade created, a healthcare need that had never existed before. You're trying to keep people alive to get from Africa to the Americas, millions of people. You're trying to keep them alive. They're trying to kill themselves. They're trying to jump overboard. They're trying to kill you. You're a doctor. What are you doing? What are you doing in this, in this situation? What are you doing as a human trafficker? And so it was trying to wrap my mind around what in the world was going on, and thinking about what was going on in the slave trade as a kind of prelude to what would happen later in the Americas. Because for most of these enslaved people, their first contact with Western medicine is in the context of the slave trade, the forced medical inspections that are being done to them, which last for hours for every single patient, where women are being pinned down and men are going into their cervix and going up in their rectums. And I mean, it's so egregious and lasted for so long. And so I really wanted to understand it, and to understand its broader historical implications for the practice of medicine, for ideas about race, for ideas about healthcare. How does healthcare function as a form of control, surveillance, and violence? What does it mean about the patient-practitioner relationship? And how is that changing in the middle of all of this? So those are the questions that are really at the core of the book in a lot of ways.
So we're at 8:35, so I'm just going to ask you one more question, because you've been so generous with your time and knowledge. This is an interesting question. This attendee says, she wants to know about your thoughts on a book called Just Medicine. And if you're familiar with it.
I'm not. When was it published, and who is the author?
I don't know if the person's still with us. Please let us know in the Q&A. I'm not familiar with that book either, but that's not surprising. There are lots of things I'm not familiar with, that I will write it down.
I've written it down too. I am intrigued. I am deeply intrigued by that.
So let's see this question, and then we'll probably say goodnight to everyone. Could you speak to how the medical, I don't know if I can, let me try this again. Okay, so this person is asking for you to speak about the medical knowledge of how African descended people and ties to spiritual practices, which I've heard you speak about in other talks. So you could do a whole talk on that, I think. So
it's so the spiritual aspects of it are so important because it's all of a whole. It's all of one piece. There is a sense and understanding of health that goes beyond just the physical body. In a lot of especially the West African cultures that I study, it is an illness that is related not only to your body, but to community or to the environment, to the economic systems that you're involved in. Medicine and healing are so imbricated with the spirit world. Oftentimes the identification even of medicinal plants and the use of certain plants. Some individuals talk about those coming to them in dreams or coming to them from their ancestors. There's a sense of a kind of holistic cosmology related to health and medicine. And, in some ways it's in my own work, as I sort of alluded to a little bit before, the things that the Europeans thought were superstitious, because there would be prayers or there would be divination in order to cure a disease. What I found in my research is that just like any people, there are a whole lot of treatments for your basic sort of ailments. People knew how to cure a whole bunch of different things, hemorrhaging and stomach aches and smallpox and measles and, all these kinds of things. But they would often go to diviners and to indigenous priests when traditional sort of understood treatments weren't working. So then it was like the therapy of second resort. You do what, you get the pepper because you have the stomach ache, but the stomach ache doesn't go away. Why isn't the stomach ache going away? And then you go to an indigenous priest, and that indigenous priest is going to try to figure out what is the seat and cause of your illness? Why are you sick? What else is going on there? And so in the work that I do, I try to sort of talk about that world in a way that doesn't just sort of exoticize and fall into the kind of, they're doing all of this, they're doing all of this witchcraft, and which is still the way some people talk about African medicine, African indigenous, traditional medicine. And it's something that I've been trying to really push against in my own work, which is why I focus a lot on, on the plants and on those cures. But, in those list of enslaved people that you saw, Jack and Atum and Didi and Amano, there are also people listed as fetish women. So even the British knew when they were enslaving these people that they had a role to play. The fetish woman would be the indigenous priestess. She had a role to play in their medical cosmology. And so it's really, there's a lot of really textured relationships between the spirit world and the medical world, which really can't be, truly disimbricated from one another.
Well, Dr. Roberts, it's 8:40. You've been with us for almost an hour and 45 minutes. Our sincerest thanks for you being here with us tonight. We're so grateful. As you know, I've been a huge fan of your work for quite some time. It's just such an honor to even be able to introduce you and moderate the Q&A. Thank you so much. And we hope you will come when your book is released. Yes. In person. Hope it's safe to do that. And for everyone out in the audience with us tonight, thank you for joining us. Please join us for future programs. Have a wonderful evening and be safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.